All right, we'll go ahead and get going as we have folks trickle in. Welcome. I am Judy Marquez Kiyama. I serve as the Associate Vice Provost for Faculty Development here at the University of Arizona, and we welcome you to this month's webinar centering Servingness. I'm very excited that on behalf of Faculty Affairs and HSI initiatives, we get to welcome you to the U of A. As I've shared before, our work around the university's HSI designation is guided by the concept of servingness. Servingness, as developed by Dr. Gina Garcia, captures the ways in which faculty and staff engage in efforts that honor the cultures and the lived experiences of Latino, Latina, Latinx, Black, Indigenous, and underrepresented students and communities. We begin today by respectfully acknowledging the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. We continue with the 3 goals of the series. By spotlighting current scholarship, we offer examples of the rich ways in which servingness is enacted by faculty and staff across the institution. And we invite others, both on campus and nationally, to learn about and engage in these efforts. And together we build knowledge. Each month we address the question, what next steps are needed to build institutional capacity around HSI servingness? Please help me welcome today's guest, Dr. Sonia Colina, who is a Regents Professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and Director of the National Center for Interpretation. Dr. Colina's areas of expertise are Spanish phonology and translation studies. I want to acknowledge Dr. Colina's honor as a Regents Professor. It is the highest distinction a faculty member can receive at the University of Arizona. The designation of Regents Professor is an honored position reserved for faculty scholars of exceptional ability who have achieved national and international distinction. The title of Regents Professor serves as recognition of the highest academic merit and is awarded to faculty members who have made a unique contribution to the quality of university through distinguished accomplishments in teaching, scholarship, research, or creative work. It is truly an honor that she has joined us today. She is the author of 4 books, the most recent being Fundamentals of Translation, published by Cambridge University Press, numerous book chapters and referee journal articles. In addition to her publications, Professor Colina has served as the investigator and consultant for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Hablamos Juntos program and as research team member for the U of A's NIH-funded project Oyendo Bien, which used the community health worker model to improve access to care by limited English proficient populations with chronic hearing loss on the Arizona-Mexico border. She is a regular faculty member in the Second Language Acquisition and Teaching Program and is affiliated with the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences. She is a founding member and past president of the American Translation and Interpreting Studies Association. Please help me welcome Dr. Sonia Colina.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you for your kind words and for the great introduction. I also like to thank the entire office of Hispanic Servant HSI initiatives, Marla, Judy, and all the staff for the invitation. It is truly an honor to be here. And I also need to, in that context, I need to say that really language and translation have not received much attention in the HSI context. There's a lot of room for growth, and this is why it's another reason why I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak on this topic. So just want to welcome you all. Thank you for being here and for your interest in the topic. So without any further ado, then I'm going to get started with the presentation. I hope it'll be of interest to you. Okay, so I'm going to be talking, as Judy said, about servingness through language beyond access and inclusion, and this is going to focus on translation. But first, a little bit of an overview of some of the topics that I'm going to cover. I'd like to talk a little bit about linguistic discrimination and non-inclusion. Then we'll move on to the notion of limited English proficiency. Then right into translation and interpretation, a little bit of interpretation, but like I said, the focus will be translation. Methodological challenges in translation with a focus on translation approach in one particular study that just came out, Colina et al. 2022. And then a few words about community-based participatory translation, to then finally conclude and wrap up the presentation, connecting linguistic capacity, translation, and servingness at the University of Arizona and other HSIs. Okay. So first of all, we do know that limited English proficient individuals are frequently excluded from important aspects of life simply because they're limited English skills. Some of them are not people who don't know English, but they're limited in their English capacity. And we'll talk about that in a second, about what that means exactly. But this kind of exclusion can take in many sorts and take place in many places in various sorts and forms, but it's very common in the courts, in the hospitals, in the schools. And of course, this restricts an individual's access to justice, to healthcare, to education. And the consequences can be really serious because in many of these contexts that I just mentioned, the stakes are really high. Just to mention a quick example that is well known by people in the field, there are many, but there was a case some years ago in which someone was taken to the hospital and the person was limited English proficient, Spanish speaker, and the word used was intoxicado, which really means poison. But the language services that the hospital provided were not adequate. And they understood that as a person being intoxicated, as in English, drunk. Of course, the treatment was quite different. The person was given some medicine and told to go home. But of course, the person in the end died because the situation was much more severe than that. So that's an example of how some of these situations can turn really serious. Like I said, we're going to I'm going to say a few words about limited English proficiency and what that means. According to the US Census, a limited English proficient individual is someone who is 5 years or older and who has reported speaking English less than very well. So the person knows some English, but not very well. Overall, the LEP population is an 8% of the total of the US population. So that's around 28 million people, which is quite large. Now, if we focus on Spanish, and according to the Migration Policy Institute in 2013, there were 64% of the total LEP population who were speakers of Spanish, about 16.2 million. So this has actually, obviously, in almost 10 years, has grown. And in Arizona, the number is actually higher. For the period of 2013-2017, the number provided by the Migration Policy Institute was 78% versus 68% in the entire nation. The federal government has, of course, regulations that prohibit against discrimination on the basis of national origin and language, Title VI, and by all agencies that receive federal funds, including funding agencies. These regulations require the provision of competent language services, and I've highlighted competent because that's going to be a crucial and important aspect of this, so that LEP individuals can have meaningful access to services, and meaningful there is also very important. So talking about federal regulations, I'd like to give you just a couple of examples of what I mean and what types of regulations there are. Some of you might be really well familiar with some of them. Of course, the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Executive Order 13166 of the year 2000. A number of national standards, for instance, the HHS National Standards in Cultural and Linguistic Appropriate Services. The DOJ, the Department of Justice guidance of the year 2002, and the HHS guidance of 2003, and there's many more. There's a number of dear colleague letters, and different kinds of guidance and regulation. What about limited English proficiency at the University of Arizona? Well, the University of Arizona is, of course, an educational setting, and in it, most students are bilingual. However, some of these students, especially a lot of the Hispanic students, have families and parents that are limited English proficient. In addition to that, in the specific case of the University of Arizona, we are a research-intensive university that conducts large numbers of research studies. Currently, it's close to 800 million in research expenditures. I think it's about 760 something. And a lot of these studies, especially those that are in the health sciences, involve LAP participants. So for these participants that are participating in a number of studies, it's important that the research instruments that are part of the study are offered to them in a language that they can understand. So that part about language they can understand is really important. But this is, of course, so that they're not excluded from participation in research studies that could benefit them. The findings of those studies could be beneficial to those communities, and that's important. And that's not just me saying it, but we have a number of studies and authors that have said that, such as Resnick and Jones in 2006. Well, at the University of Arizona, as in many other institutions, despite the legislation and best intentions in elsewhere, like I said, other institutions and other campuses, this is not unique to us. I've worked at different places before coming to the University of Arizona, and the situation is not very different. We find that sometimes LAP individuals are excluded from research studies, not intentionally, but as a result of a number of obstacles that language can pose for researchers. In some cases, the obstacles are financial. There's not enough money in the budget or to take care of these issues. Sometimes they're practical. They just, the researchers don't have the time, although we all know they should make it, but they have not planned for it and they don't have the knowledge. Sometimes they find that they don't know where to start in terms of providing all these documents in languages other than English. So, well, one solution to for this is, of course, translation and interpretation. It's a way in which we can provide research instruments in the participant's language. And just to be a little more clear here, translation refers to written language or the written transfer, rewriting of one document form from a language to another, while interpreting is oral. In lay language and lay terms, sometimes translating is used to refer to both. But in more technical materials than what I'm going to be talking about today, translation is about written language. So the focus, as I said, is going to be on translation, written language, although sometimes it can involve a mix of modalities where we have a little bit of some oral materials mixed with written or maybe even some graphics. Okay, so we're talking about translation. Is that enough? If I provide a service, if I provide a translation text, can I say that I've accomplished my goal, that service and that servingness has been accomplished, or that I serve that population? That definitely is not the case. I see servingness is something that demands much more than checking a language box. Providing a text in a non-majority language written in translation definitely does not guarantee inclusion, engagement, or equitable participation. How do we know this? Well, we do have evidence and research, a number of studies that I've provided there, for instance, De Jong, Whaley, Fourier, Feinauer, that actually suggest that when instruments are translated, study subjects fail to engage and participate in the same terms as their English-speaking counterparts. What does this mean? Well, for instance, the subjects may not understand the questions in the survey, and therefore they may provide fewer or incomplete answers. They may be unreliable. And all of this, of course, has obvious consequences for the validity and reliability of the data collected. Well, we might wonder why is the case. Why is it that if we provide a translation that supposedly, we've done our best and we checked all our boxes, it's written in the language of the limited English proficient individual, this should be fine, right? And we've done what we're supposed to do. Well, not really. Translation alone per se and by itself is not necessarily guaranteed that the outcome that necessitated it is achieved. So after we've made the decision to translate, there's still a number of methodological challenges that remain, having to do with the translation's usability, with our ability to be able to use the translation for the purpose that we intended it. And I'm going to focus and say a few things about quality, readability, and approach in that regard as methodological challenges. Quality, well, shouldn't it be sufficient to provide quality services? If I provided a quality translation, shouldn't I just be satisfied with that? Yes, however, this is not as simple as it may seem. I mean, what do we mean by quality? Is it just using correct language, whatever we mean by correct language? Maybe a high register? Is that enough? Is that what we want? Usable language? How do we measure this? Furthermore, how does a researcher know that the non-English materials work as intended and that actually research participants understand these materials? So these are questions that are somewhat complicated to answer. So moving on to readability and translation, we also have studies that show, such as Giovanni et al. 2015, that show that translations in general tend to exhibit lower readability than non-translated text, than original text. Another study, Rob et al., found that patient information materials had poor readability, and the readability was average to difficult. And they attributed this, at least in part, to the translation process. These were translated materials. You may wonder what readability is. Just briefly, some of you will be familiar with it, but others may not. It's briefly is a measure of the ease in which, with which a text can be understood by a reader. And it's usually measured or assessed looking at formulas that include sentence length, syllable structure, word familiarity. Readability is something that has been somewhat discredited. Maybe discredited is kind of like a strong word, but still the people are aware that it does not post all the answers. It's still being used. And there's a difference between readability and comprehensibility, which has to do with how the reader interacts with the text and whether the reader can actually understand what's in the text. Readability, of course, contributes to comprehensibility because a text that has shortened sentences, words that are familiar to the reader may be easier, may be more comprehensible than one that doesn't. Okay, translation approach. By approach, I refer to the overall framework that guides the translation decision-making process. For instance, if I'm trying to make a decision between two possible translations, what criteria do I use to decide whether translation A or B is better? And when we talk about approaches, we mention sometimes functionalist or linguistic or equivalence-based approaches. Approach is a translation-specific term that goes beyond. Is much more than simply the procedure. Procedures that sometimes are referred to in the literature as do a one-way translation or do a two-way translation, review for errors, a two-member panel. So those things are fine, but they're more. They also have an impact on quality, but they're more focused on the general process. And sort of ignore a little bit, don't focus so much on the strategic, on the strategies that we used in translation, like I mentioned before, right? Yeah. Okay, so when I'm talking about translation approach, I want to put more emphasis on that aspect of translation, making translation decisions. So the translation approach that someone may use, linguistic or equivalence or equivalent or even functionalist approach, has an effect on a number of factors. For instance, Coco et al. Studied the effect of the translation approach on readability. And they found that the translations of a PROM, a patient-reported outcome measure, that used a functionalist approach had actually better readability than published counterparts than other translations that had not used that functionalist approach, but had a more literal, more equivalence-based approach. Other studies also tell us that translation approach has an effect on the user's preference for a certain type of translation and how they evaluate it. For instance, Furia and Feinauer found that there are clear differences between the translations of a quality of life questionnaire produced with two approaches. On the one hand, a linguistic or literal approach, and on the other, a communicative and functional one. In their study, users evaluated the translations produced with a communicative approach or functional approach as superior and easier to understand. So another another study that has to do with investigating translation approaches that I wanted to mention here is one authored by a number of collaborators and myself, and just recently published. This was funded by a COH faculty research grant. And we wanted to see in this study how translation approach affects the usability and intelligibility of translated survey. So we also were interested in empirically testing the hypothesis that there are some translation approaches that produce translations that are more user-friendly and more intelligible than others. So briefly, let me just tell you a little bit about this study. In terms of the methods, we selected a published translation of the perceived stress scale, which is also another PROM, a patient-reported outcome measure. And the one, the published translation that we found, we studied, we analyzed it, and we thought that it reflected quite a literal approach, more of a linguistic approach to the translation. So then we also drafted a new one using a functionalist collaborative approach that we describe in Colina et al. 2017. So then we have two translations, both were from English into Mexican Spanish, and we hypothesized that translation A, the one with a more literal approach, a more linguistic approach, would be more difficult to understand than B. We recruited participants at the campus of the University of Arizona through flyers and word of mouth. We consented them, of course, after getting all our IRBs. And there were 20 of them, and we asked them to complete the bilingual language profile questionnaire to measure their degree of bilingualism. Then we asked them to complete the two translated versions of the PSS, and this was followed by semi-structured oral interviews about the content of the surveys, the questions that were asked in the translation. So they were asked to identify questions that were unclear, hard to understand, that contained unusual expressions. We also asked them to tell us which one of the two translated surveys they preferred and why. We recorded the interviews and transcribed them. And the data analysis that we did was both quantitative and qualitative. So just to give you a quick overview of the results. One sample t-test confirmed that the subjects actually found translation A more difficult to understand than B. And we know this because they raised more issues. We had asked them about, what are some problems here? What are words that you don't understand, things that are difficult to answer. So they raised more issues about the surveys of question items in A than in B. And this is what you can see more visually here. Translation A is the one in red, and that's the number of issues that the participants raised. And then here we have the fewer issues. We also did a per item analysis of the data. And we found that 5 questions in survey A were mentioned by more than 5 participants. So in that same survey, there were a number of questions that were being frequently mentioned by the participants as having some kind of awkward construction, something that was not easy to understand, something along those lines. So this is what you can see here in figure 2, where each one of the bars corresponds to one question. So we have question number 1 and number 2 in red for translation A and in blue for translation B. So as you can see, there's a lot more issues raised about more questions in translation A. One more aspect, more element having to do with the results. The preference that we found for the functionalist translation for translation B was interestingly associated with Spanish dominance. I had said before that we administered the BLP, which is a test that assesses the degree of bilingualism. So looking at that and looking at the preference for the functionalist translation, we could see that the more dominant in the target language speakers were, the greater the preference for the functionalist translation. And this is something, again, that we can see here. Line 0, I don't know if it's very easy to see, but this horizontal line, line 0, will be perfect bilingualism. From 0 to 150, I still have a hard time seeing it, yeah. From 0 to 150, then we would have English dominance, right? So for instance, this bar here indicates someone who is very high on their dominance scale in English. And the from 0 to minus 150 will be dominance in Spanish. So this person here will be mostly monolingual in Spanish with a little bit of knowledge of English. Okay. So then again, we can see that most of the people who are dominant in Spanish have a preference for B, whereas the ones who are dominant in English have more of a preference for A. Okay, so what are some of the takeaways of this study, briefly? Well, we can definitely conclude what other studies that I reviewed earlier had noticed, that had found that translation approaches and the way we decide to make decisions about translation have an impact on the usability of the translation. So this means that translators need to adjust their approach depending on the purpose and the audience of the translation. And therefore, training and awareness is going to be needed. Many translators are not aware of this because they have not been trained. Sometimes they have been trained on just one approach and in a way which is not really explicit. They're just trained to translate without realizing that there are different ways of approaching this process. Interestingly, the guidelines published by health and government agencies tend not to discuss translation approach as a factor that could influence the usability of translations. And we can see this in European guidelines, the guidelines issued by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and all the guidelines for translation. The results also have implications for a lot of research in the health sciences. In the health sciences, back translation is the most commonly used method to assess the quality of translated research instruments. And the problem is that back translation favors a literal rather than a functionalist approach. So back translation, for those of you who may not be familiar, means that when we produce a translation from the source text in English, for instance, into Spanish, in order to test and make sure and assess that that Spanish translation is good quality, someone is asked to translate it back into English. That's why it's called back translation. And then both they're compared and making sure the goal is to see that they match. So of course, the more literal that translation into Spanish is, then the better it's going to match once we back translate it into English. Now we know that languages don't always match. Most of the time they don't. So we have, if a translator knows that the translation is going to be assessed through back translation, then they're going to tend to favor a literal approach, which may not always work. Okay, so that's an important takeaway from that. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about translation approach, what would be then if it's possible to have different translation approaches that produce different results and have an effect on both the usability and the preference for a translation, what would we recommend? Well, a translation approach that I would recommend for some types of community research done at the U of A is what I have called in some work, in some past work, a functionalist collaborative participatory translation model, CBPT, which is aligned with a community-based participatory research model. What does this mean? Okay, I'm sure many of you might be familiar with community-based participatory research, or sometimes it goes by other names, patient-centered outcomes research. It refers to an approach to conducting research that equitably involves community members, researchers, and other stakeholders in the research process. So the researchers don't just come to a community to collect data and go away and get their work done. They involve the community. The questions that guide their research have to do with the community needs. And so then all partners are going to contribute expertise and share in decision making, not only the researchers. As Horowitz et al. Put it, community-based participatory research partners researchers and those directly affected by the research conducted. So community-based participatory research actually constitutes what I would call the cultural and linguistic dimension of community-based participatory research. If the research that we're doing in some community-based projects is community-based participatory research, then the materials, the non-English materials that we develop, the research instruments have to be guided by a similar type of approach, which would be CBPT, the equivalent of CBPR in the realm of translation and language. So a few more things about CBPT. Translations within a CBPT model are created with a functionalist approach. That means that translation decisions are based on the audience and then the purpose of the translation. And this is also determined with community participation and community decision-making power. So translations are going to use the language that works for the community, not the language that's imposed by a vendor who might be working in Argentina or in Spain, in another speaking country. They may have nothing to do with the community we're trying to serve. And so the language that works for the community is used, and this is decided in consultation with experts. CBPT also connects students and staff with community through language and research participation. And CBPT exemplifies linguistic servingness. I'd like to present just briefly with a couple of slides what I consider a case study and a good example of CBPT. We didn't call it CBPT when we were using it, when we were actually following this model, but it's really CBPT is Oyendo Bien 2.0 in my mind. So Oyendo Bien was an NIH-funded multiple-year project that aimed to develop and test the effectiveness of an innovative community healthcare worker intervention that aimed to expand access to care and healthcare among older adults that were facing healthcare disparities. I said was because the funding period ended, but the consequences of the study and the connections in the networks have not, and the type of work has continued in many other ways. The PI was Nicole Maroney in the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences. Okay, so this is described, sorry, I forgot to mention that, is described in an article on Colleen et al. 2017. And why is this an example of maybe a former version of CBPT? Well, at that point, we called it functionalist participatory translation in that publication in 2017. And it is functionalist because, well, sorry, I should step back a little bit and say that I'm referring to the materials that we used to engage with the participants in this project. The participants were people living in Nogales, Arizona, so a majority of them were limited English proficient and Spanish dominant. So of course, there had to be a lot of research instruments and all kinds of materials, not just research instruments that were in Spanish. Some of them were developed originally in Spanish. others where some version, some type of translation in a broader sense, based on some kind of English document. So for those documents, we used a functionalist approach to translation, in which the translation decisions, are we going to translate this as A or B, are based on the purpose of the translation. So we tried to make decisions on the basis of whether this would be a translation that was appropriate for this population and for our purposes. What was it that we wanted to do with those documents? But it was also participatory because the people that were in charge of the translation wasn't just one translator and one editor, but we had really the whole community involved in this. We had community members that were stakeholders and partners in the translation of research materials, community health workers, as well as the researchers, and also a translation studies expert that was guiding the process. Some of them were entirely bilingual, some of them were monolingual. The way the process worked is we started with two translations, one created by a member of the community with some translation expertise, was a graduate student, and then another one created by another translator. We asked the community members to select one of the two that seemed most appropriate to both of them, and then we used that as a starting point for a discussion with all these stakeholders and trying to figure out some of the terms and some of the translations that were more appropriate for our purposes, for everyone's purposes. Okay, so that was an example, then a case study of CBPT. So how do we apply in a broader sense that type of translation model at the University of Arizona and other HSIs? I believe that the University of Arizona is in a privileged position to develop a CBPT model, at least minimally for community-based research, because it has a lot of very useful resources that are already there, existing resources. For instance, there's the translators and specialists in translation studies at the National Center for Interpretation. We also have, the university has a well-established network of community partnerships. Of course, countless researchers in the bilingual community on and off campus. All of these resources are fundamental for building linguistic capacity for CBPT specifically, but also for translation in general and language services. And we can do this through testing, training, and services. Of course, the model and resources can be shared and replicated at other HSIs. So we build linguistic capacity through testing, training, and services. How do we do that a little more specifically? What do I mean by testing, training, and services as ways to build linguistic capacity? Well, here's a very broad way of describing this. We could identify qualified campus community members that have the right level of bilingualism. This can be done through testing. Once that has happened, training comes in, and then we can provide appropriate training in translation and translation approach for these community members. And then once we have trained community members, they can serve as ad hoc or dual role translators or interpreters. Like I said, I wasn't focusing so much on interpreting today, but at their workplace. So for instance, I do know that there are some units at the University of Arizona, they have a lot of needs for translation, and sometimes they use bilingual students or bilingual staff, which is good because it's using the resources of that community that I'm talking about, and it's involved in the community. But at the same time, we need to systematize this process. We need to identify which one of those individuals have the capacity that we can build on through testing. Then we can train them, and then they can serve in certain capacities. Perhaps not all of them, but definitely some of those that involve the community and community-based participatory research. Okay, so just tying all these threads together now before concluding in a few minutes. So how does linguistic capacity then relate to translation and servingness? So as I said, community-based participatory translation contributes to servingness in the area of research, possibly in other areas too. And it does so because it engages student scientists and communities in research through negotiation and collaboration. It also engages qualified bilingual students in the translation and research process. It fosters collaborative knowledge generation. On the one hand, we have university resources in the area of translation, which are a community asset. And also we have community resources in language and culture, which are crucial to building capacity in translation and multilingual research. So we have units and centers like the National Center for Interpretation, but at the same time, we have that bilingual community, which is in close contact with the specific forms of language and culture that that community needs to be served, to be better served. CVPT also serves as a validating factor for students in bilingual stuff. We can assist and engage with the communities. We do know that there are some indicators of servingness that include non-academic outcomes, and they have to do with the campus experiences of students and staff, in many cases, students. We can provide that experience on campus that serves as a validating factor for their communities and for previous lived experiences. Many of these students have actually served for translators and interpreters in the past for their families. Finally, CVPT offers student-centered opportunities for research and learning. And just to conclude, a few takeaways from my entire talk. I like to stress that language, and in particular translation, of course interpreting as well, have had an underutilized role in servingness. So there's a lot of potential for doing things, for growing here. Much more attention needs to be paid to this area. Because like I said, there's a great potential for servingness. It's also important to know that translation for servingness is much more than just simple service provision. It's not just offering a translation or an interpretive service and check in the box. We need to make sure that we understand the process and provide the type of translation and service that fulfills the purpose that we want to achieve with that translation. And finally, in community-based participatory research, translation should also be community-based and participatory rather than having the translation sent out to a vendor. This definitely creates the structure for linguistic and cultural servingness. With that, thank you very much. And I think we'll be ready for questions. Thank you everyone for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much. I wrote down a number of different really specific ways in which you offered examples of the ways in which we can tie this work directly to servingness, not only here, but at other HSIs. And I think that of course is the end question that I always pose to folks, but you wove it throughout the entire presentation, which I appreciate so much. So I will hold my questions because I know that we have Eileen Wong, who has posed one, and we'll ask you to unmute, Eileen, if you'd like, so that you can go ahead and ask Dr. Colina your question yourself rather than us reading it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Colina, for a fantastic presentation. It's always so inspiring to hear about what you do. I know I get to see a small glimpse in our collaborations, but it's just such inspiring work. My question is, and I'll just boil it down to, how do we scale these efforts up? How do we meet the need of limited English proficiency populations? And is there anything specific we need in terms of supports or resources, especially at the university level, to really elevate this work and to further servingness?
Yes, that is a great question. I could be talking about it for a long time, but just very briefly, yes, of course, it boils down to resources. But that's what everyone could say about any important initiative. The The advantage that we have here is that we already have an infrastructure at the University of Arizona to be able to do this. We just have to systematize it. We have to make people aware of what we have and share resources that at this point they're somewhat dispersed throughout campus. Many people on campus do not know about the National Center for Interpretation, do not know about the expertise that we have in the center, which is not limited to services. Like I was saying in the presentation, we can help with testing and we can help with training. So that's how we can involve that community that we already have on campus. So we already have that. If we put all our resources together and we sort of centralize and systematize what we already have in the center, I think that could be really elevated. Much of my work since I became director of the center has been my work, my mission, actually, the way I saw my role as the director has been to really make sure that people know about the center on campus. The center has been very well known nationally and internationally, but not so much on campus. So, I thought, well, if people know about this, we can pull all the resources together. We can help people understand the importance not only of this type of work, but the importance of what the center does and how lucky the university is to have the center. This is not to toot my own horn because I've only served as director for 5 years. There's a director who had the foresight for San Dueñas Gonzalez almost 40 years ago to start work in this area. So this is a great resource that the university has. I believe that we can amplify, we can make it much larger, joining all our resources, and even more so with all the HSIs. Each HSI does not have to have a resource like this, but there's an infrastructure that we can all use and we can pull resources together. And certainly we can elevate this.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I just want to share, because Dr. Kalina was so wonderful to share that you all have a listserv, correct, for the center that we can join if we'd like.
Yes.
And how can we, maybe how can others get in contact with that listserv?
Yeah, if you just email the center, NCITRP, I'll put the email in the chat at arizona.edu and just ask them to put you on the listserv, they'll do it. Let me put the email in the chat, just a second.
I want to follow up on one of Eileen's questions and one of your responses around, possibilities for partnering with other HSIs. Dr. Marla Franco created the HSI AZ Consortium. So, a consortium of HSIs across the state of Arizona. And I wonder what possibilities for collaboration, even in the next year, you might imagine, and then what resources might be needed on our end or across the institution that could help bring those other HSIs together in support of this work.
Oh,
you just
yeah, I mean, we could, the resources, I mean, it'd be just great if it was possible to organize some kind of consortium like that. People who are interested in this area, similar to what we're doing with the current one, much smaller, of course, much more focused on translation and interpreting. Of course, they have a big grant that's supporting all the planning and beyond. So it would be great, if we could apply for some grant that might make this possible. Or, I mean, another option, of course, grants sometimes are very restricted in what they allow, what they don't allow, and it might be hard to if we're just looking for something that will fit. That's an option, but another one might be if the institutions actually contribute a little, to put all their resources together, even if it's just a little bit. It could be a pilot at first, and then I will always believe that once people see the benefits of this, then they'll really invest in it. And it doesn't have to be a large amount. I've done on my own work, not necessarily the work of the center, but I've worked with a number of grants, just like Oyendo Bien. There's been a number of them having to do with these issues with grants, right? A lot of the funding agencies want to see language access plans. They want to see, and maybe not so much when I say language access, that has a more technical meaning, right? But maybe a plan, I should say a plan for dealing with limited English proficient participants. And they want to see it ahead of time before the grant is submitted. So there's a lot of need for that. I've been contacted by people outside the university to do that. So those plans go in the grants, and they make it easier for the grant for the researchers to get that grant. So it is possible to do something like that with grant funding and money to do that. And that would, of course, if that's the difference, if that makes the difference between getting a grant and not getting it, that's already paid for itself, you know, the little investment that might be. Yeah.
Thank you. We do have one more question, and Christian or Christian, I'm not sure how to properly pronounce your name, but please unmute and go ahead and pose your question. We'd love to hear from you.
Hi, Dr. Colina. Let me just, well, I got changed into a different mode. I don't know where my question went, so I'll try to remember what it was. I was interested in this community-based participatory method and how it might work in very multilingual communities like border regions and migrant corridors, particularly when you have like Spanish varieties from Oaxaca or South America, Central America, all one space. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Good question. That's always the limited diffusion languages or minority languages are always difficult when it comes to training, right? Because there's not enough demand to justify the investment in training. So that's always difficult. The center has tried to apply for grants in the past. It's always a challenge. However, there are ways to deal with that. If we have to do it without a grant that allow for the development of materials, training materials for them. One way to do that is to do, for instance, and in this case, I'm talking about interpreting, which is much more in need for some of those languages. It's more urgent than translation in some cases for courts and for healthcare. But one way to deal with that is language neutral training. So you do some training that has to do, for instance, in interpreting with the modalities of interpreting and interpreting in general. And then you find tutors that work with those languages to work with a specific group, specific language group that you have. And you may have, in some cases, those people may not be interpreters per se. They may be just very advanced language learners or language or speakers that would have to be trained themselves to then train the new interpreters, a train the trainer kind of situation. Right? So I don't know if that was clear enough, but it is a challenging area. And basically the way we handle it, if there's no funding for development, which has been the case, ideally you want more funding and you can develop their materials. You do language neutral training, when you just deal with strategies and techniques, and it can be done for translation just as well. And then you do tutoring, you do small group training with language specialists. So I don't know if that addresses your question. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and we will invite Ai. Am I pronouncing correctly?
Oh yeah, sorry, it kind of just lagged a bit there. I just have a question. So I work with a couple of organizations and I speak Spanish and Japanese myself actually, so I'm very familiar with a lot of the things that come with translation. And my question was kind of like if you've done any work or if you have any insight or advice for like employers or people requesting of translation services, because something that we do in the different organizations I work for is like language justice. And so a lot of the times people who are asked to translate and interpret are usually not compensated, but they're expected to do this, on top of their other duties as assigned, but not necessarily not necessarily compensated for, but still doing the same amount of work, or they're still getting the same pay. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So it looks like you understand my question. Sorry for the word babble, but I
No,
wonder if you could comment on that, please.
No, I understand exactly what you mean because it's very common. And in a way, it's ironic, right? Because if some of these groups or groups that are working on language justice, at the same time, they're doing a great injustice to these people that, they're not being treated fairly compared to their core workers. They're not expected to do the same, right? If they have a monolingual coworker, they're not expected to, in addition to their job duties, to do translation and interpretation. So that is ironic, and that's one thing I would say to those employers if they're in language justice or any other kind of language access or social justice organization. Say, well, you're aiming for this, but in this case, you're the one to blame. You can't do this with these individuals. So that's the first thing. And the second one is, well, you also need to make sure that you have someone who can actually handle the job. You need to know what their level of proficiency is in the language, and you need to know what their level of skill is as a translator and interpreter. So then I would recommend that they contact places like us, like the National Center for Interpretation, that can determine, can test them, as an interpreter and say, determine the level that they're at and be able to advise in terms of the training that they might need. We work with a lot of groups that actually ask us for on-demand training. We have training that is offered regularly, but then we also train groups in the schools and healthcare organizations that have a lot of bilinguals that have not had experience as translators or interpreters, but we can help them train them depending on their level of skill. So this is what I would tell them. They may not have a lot of money for that, but like I said, there are grants, and this is something at least that they need to have in mind and know that this is the goal. And maybe they can get there little by little, but they need to understand that they're putting their employees in a situation that is, in a way, pretty similar to the kind of situations that they're trying to fight.
Thank you all for these really excellent questions. Thank you, Dr. Colina, for just an incredible presentation. And for, like I said, weaving this question about institutionalizing servingness throughout the entire talk, and the importance of doing so, not just for the U of A as an HSI, but across our HSI colleagues in Arizona, across the country. And so I look forward to hopefully much more collaboration about this work, with this work, and of course with our communities. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your generosity in sharing. Thank you all for being here. We will make sure to have this up, the video recorded up on our HSI Initiatives YouTube channel to access within a few weeks. And we'll be back on March 17th for our next webinar, and it'll be focused on food insecurities and servingness. And we look forward to seeing you there. And we'll hang out for just a couple of minutes, but thank you all for being here. Have a great day.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Bye.